Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final lecture on the theories of crime. In today's lecture, we'll be looking at learning and situational factors, which are also known as social factors that contribute towards the development of deviant and criminal behaviors. This is a follow up to the previous two lectures where we covered the biological theories of crime and the social and psychological theories or the developmental factors that contribute towards crime. At the end of this lecture, we will also look at how these different components or these different factors can actually be integrated to give us a holistic picture of what contributes or what causes crime or deviant behaviors to occur in some individuals and not others. Proponents of the learning and situational factors that look at how these factors contribute towards crime are similar to those who believe in the importance of learning and situational factors for all other behaviors. Specifically to the development of criminal and deviant behaviors, they say that while human beings are born neutral, and because they're born neutral, they actually don't even have a concept of what is good or what is bad or what being indifferent to what is good or bad actually is. They have no concept of moral values, religious values, societal values. In fact, it is through the experiences of interacting with others and living within a society that they decide what is good, bad, or indifferent, and they learn this through the social norms of the area or the environment that they live in. They also propose that individuals are determined largely by their environment, and therefore we learn what is right or what is wrong, what behaviors we want to follow, or what behaviors we do not want to follow by listening and observing others' behaviors, that is modeling. And we also learn by watching the consequences of their behaviors, processing this information, and remembering whether their behaviors or their actions were rewarded or punished. Learning and situational theories propose that both modeling, that is, observing and then repeating the behaviors of somebody that they look up to, and frustration, whether it is intense or and short term or prolonged and long term, can both be involved in the development of criminal or deviant behaviors. Both these factors, as mentioned earlier, can result in criminal behaviors, but they are likely to produce very different types of criminals. Modeling behaviors, yeah, um, usually results in someone learning deviant behaviors through the process of conditioning, specifically operant conditioning and modeling. And this results in the socialized offender who learns his behaviors by observing the people around him. On the other hand, frustration, especially when it is prolonged and intense, is likely to result in the individualized offender who does not so much learn offending or deviant behaviors from the people around him, but uses these deviant behaviors as a coping mechanism to actually deal with the frustration or what he perceives to be unfair treatment from the environment around him. We will look at both these factors and how they can develop or result in deviant behaviors in the next few slides. In terms of modeling or conditioning specifically, learning theories propose that all behavior is learned, that is, nothing is genetically programmed, which really opposes the biological theorists who propose that much of deviant behavior or the propensity to commit crime is actually genetic in nature. Learning theories propose that the behavior is, or deviant behavior is learned through the roles of rewards and punishments. And the deviant behavior that they learn through the roles of rewards and punishments, which we will look at in just a few minutes, does not just include the techniques of actually producing deviant behavior, as in how do you steal, or how do you hotwire a car, how do you shoplift, or how do you sell drugs, or how do you abuse somebody or molest somebody, but it also includes rationalizations or justifications for the actions that they have committed which may be against social norms and sometimes may even be things that they are uncomfortable with doing themselves. So, how do they rationalize these behaviors to make them more comfortable with it? These rationalizations are then dependent on the attitudes that they have towards social norms, towards breaking the law or following the law. As I mentioned earlier, the roles of rewards and punishment are very important in the whole learning process. For example, let's look at someone who is peddling drugs to earn quick money illegally instead of working legitimately. As you may already know, peddling drugs can earn somebody up to $15,000 a week by just selling drugs at a coffee shop, sitting in a coffee shop, drinking a beer or a coffee for a few hours a night, 2 to 3 times a week. And this is in the Singapore context. Compare that to somebody who is of a similar education background, who has similar work experiences, and in this case, particularly, not very much education, perhaps secondary two and below, perhaps not much valid work experience in terms of work skills. He may work 5 hours, 5 days a week, sorry, and a total of 40 hours a week and earn about $1,500 a month. You compare that to about $15,000 a week, working a total of 12 hours a week. It's easy to see how peddling drugs can quickly help somebody earn a lot of money in a very short time, especially compared to legitimate work. Now, if this behavior of sitting in the coffee shop and selling the drugs is rewarded in the sense that person does get the big cash benefit and is not caught, he's likely to repeat the behaviors. He's also somebody else who is watching his behavior is also likely to be encouraged to model and follow on these behaviors because he sees that there is a lot of benefit in actually practicing these behaviors. On the other hand, if the person who is peddling the drugs is punished and caught very, very quickly and punished severely, he is likely to avoid the behavior in the future because the costs of this behavior far outweigh the benefits of the behavior. Somebody who is watching these behaviors of peddling the drugs in this case is also unlikely to repeat this action because he or she realizes that he's quickly going to be punished and again the costs outweigh the benefits of the behavior. Another example of how the costs of a particular behavior may be less than the pros of the particular behavior is illustrated in this newspaper article here. You can't see the whole article, but basically, this article is based on a news story that was published in the papers last year, where the police arrested about almost 150 people in a 4-day anti loan sharking raid, and these people that they arrested were mostly the runners and not really the main loan sharks. When questioned, these runners said that they felt they had no other choice but to actually harass other debtors because they themselves owed the loan sharks money and they could no longer service the loan in terms of both the principal and the very high interest rate. Many of them were offered a so-called deal by the loan shark where they were told if they harassed other debtors, either by painting their houses with "oh money pay money," putting a pig's head there, or just threatening them either on the phone or face to face, the interest on the total amount that they owed the loan shark would be reduced. On the other hand, if they refused to participate in these activities, they themselves would be the target of other loan shark runners. For example, they may be beaten up, their family members threatened, or their family members abused in turn. In this case, many of these runners who were caught said they felt that they had no other choice but to actually assist the loan shark in these activities because the cost of not doing so was much higher than the cost of actually engaging in these activities, even though they knew there was a possibility that they would be caught. There are many different social learning theories that can be actually used to help explain the development of deviant behaviors. One of the leading theories in this area is actually what is known as Sutherland's differential association theory. Sutherland proposes that crime is learned through the process of social interaction with both the environment that somebody lives in and the peers that he or she deals with on a daily basis. He says that These differential associations that we develop vary in its frequency, in the sense of how often they come up or we remember them, their duration, how long they last, priority in terms of how important they may be to us, as well as the intensity, that is, the strength of the impact that it has on us. He proposes that the differential associations that we develop with others shapes our individuals of our own attitudes and meanings, which then in turn affects how we evaluate our own behaviors as whether it is good or bad or whether we are indifferent towards certain actions. He says that these differential associations, as mentioned earlier, is strongly influenced by who we hang out with and who we influence and who we associate with. And as mentioned earlier, these influences actually have a stronger impact on the development of our attitudes, behaviors, and thought processes, much, much stronger than what we would assume for it to be. He therefore proposes that in terms of the development of differential associations, there are two main points that we need to pay attention to. Firstly, that crime is learned behavior. That is, it is not something that somebody is born with. It's not that somebody has a genetic propensity to commit crime. Instead, it is learned through an interaction with other persons or a process of communication with others. These communications could be direct in terms of face to face communication or even communication through emotes, but they could also be indirect, for example, through what we see or what we hear or what we read in the media. He proposes that the process of learning criminal behaviors by association with criminals or anti-criminal patterns involves all the similar mechanisms that come into play in any other forms of learning. For example, things like modeling and conditioning. He also suggests that the learning of criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups, which also suggests that if somebody doesn't have much direct contact with those who actually already display deviant behavior, it is unlikely that they are going to develop deviant behaviors or learn these techniques themselves. Linked to that is what he says is that when criminal behavior is learned, what we learn is not just the techniques of committing the crime, whether they're simple or very complicated, but also the specific directions of our motives, why we want to commit the crime, what we think crime can help us achieve, what motivates us to commit the crimes, how we rationalize these behaviors that may go against our own values or beliefs, and also our attitudes towards deviant behaviors. Secondly, he also says that crime is definitely motivated behavior. In that sense, that crime is goal directed. Somebody doesn't just get involved in it accidentally or for fun, but they get involved in it because they think that they are able to achieve a goal or something that is of value to them after that is committed or after their involvement in deviant behaviors. He also suggests that the specific direction of the motives and the drives that we learn um, are dependent on whether we see the legal codes as being favorable or unfavorable. If we think that legal codes are favorable or they are to our benefit, we are less likely to commit crime. On the other hand, if we think that they're not to our benefit or they don't make sense, we are more likely to commit crime. This suggests that a person becomes delinquent because of an excess of definitions that are favorable towards the violation of the law. And this, in summary, is what he calls the principle of differential association. Ronald Akers, another learning theorist, used Sutherland's differential association theory as a base. He expanded this theory to create or to develop what we now know as Akers' social learning theory. This specific social learning theory is focused on why and how people are motivated to commit crime and to learn the skills required for crime through association with deviant peers. That is, this theory is basically, in a sense, focused on how people learn to become criminals. He asserts that if you have delinquent friends, you're more likely to indulge in delinquent behaviors. because he believes in the old adage that birds of a feather flock together. Um, he cites that delinquent kids are more likely to hang around one another because they share a common trait of delinquency, and because they hang around and they frequently interact with each other, this trait of delinquent behaviors is actually amplified. Therefore, he suggests that criminal behavior is largely dependent on the norms within the society. In this case, for example, it could be the norms within their own deviant social group. Because they engage in these delinquent behaviors, they reinforce these behaviors amongst themselves, and therefore they are more likely to commit deviant acts. He also suggests that the probability of indulging or getting involved in deviant behavior is increased, and the probability of conforming to social norms is decreased as they interact more and more with deviant behaviors, as deviancy becomes the norm and following social norms becomes an anomaly. This is whether somebody or an individual learns these criminal behaviors in terms of not just the techniques, but also the attitudes, the rationalizations, the justifications, as mentioned earlier, depends on the different types of reinforcers that they receive for not just the behaviors, but also voicing certain thoughts or attitudes. Firstly, effectiveness. The level of positive reinforcement that they receive for certain behaviors will determine if the behavior will be repeated or not. Um, Logically, what this means is that the stronger the positive reinforcement for a deviant behavior, the more likely the behavior will be repeated. Secondly, availability, in the sense that the more available the social norms are for the involvement in deviant behaviors, the more likely that deviant behavior is going to be repeated. Not just the availability or the accessibility of the norms, but perhaps also the availability of the opportunity to actually engage in that behavior. This could be, for example, related to the availability or access to weapons or availability or access to drugs. The frequency that the behavior is committed and also the probability of the reinforcer occurring determines the strengths of the criminal behavior. That is, the more frequently the criminal behavior is reinforced, the more likely the criminal behavior will be repeated. Expectancy theory, on the other hand, proposes that individuals are actually very rational creatures, and when deciding on whether to engage in criminal behaviors or not, many actually contemplate rationally the costs versus the benefits of criminal opportunities. That is, again, criminal behavior is definitely goal directed, and engagement in crime is based on the expectations that they will be rewarded for their criminal behavior. That is, performance is determined by an expectation that it would result in a certain outcome. Factors that could increase the expected cost of crime, which, for example, could include increased apprehension or increased likelihood of punishment, on the other hand, would reduce the motivation to commit crime. Similarly, factors that increase the benefits of crime, for example, the lack of good job opportunities to earn money legitimately, would increase the likelihood of involvement in crime. Modeling or imitational learning may also play a role in this. And when we look at the impact of the role model on the certain behaviors, a role model has a more significant or stronger impact the more important that role model is to the particular person. And perhaps what's most important is not just what they verbally say, but their actions. In this sense, actions do indeed speak louder than words. Let's take, for example, a famous sporting figure who is paid to promote a drug free lifestyle. Younger people who look up to him or who are influenced by him may pay attention to this. But knowing that he's being paid to participate in a certain campaign may reduce the effectiveness of his pro social norm behaviors, especially if in his own time he actually exhibits the opposite behaviors. If this same person then is caught for drunk driving and gets punished for it, um, that behavior is less likely to be repeated. However, if he gets caught for drunk driving and he's not punished for it for some reason or other, the likelihood of younger people who look up to him actually modeling the so-called deviant behavior of drunk driving is much, much higher than them modeling the pro-social behavior of being leading an active lifestyle, not drinking and driving, not indulging in drugs, especially when they know that these pro-social behaviors are actually, in a sense, something that they're paid for and not something that they are voluntarily doing. Another, or one of the social theorists that has proposed a widely accepted theory of involvement in criminal behavior is Robert K. Merton, and he has proposed what we now know of as Merton's strain theory. His basic premise is that socially accepted goals pressurize people to conform to what is thought of as being the right thing to do within a society, what people look up to you for, what people expect you to do, what is the good thing to have, or what is good to be known for. However, he suggests that not everybody is able to conform to these goals because they may have limited access to amenities or opportunities that actually help them achieve these goals. For example, he proposed that although many, or if not most people, want to rise above poverty, the social structure limits access to success as determined by not being poor and being rich through legitimate means such as being educated in college or at the university level. They may not have access to this education, for example, because to start with, they don't have the money to pay for college fees, or they may not have the basic educational levels required for this. Um, he suggests that when people are unable to conform to these goals, they either learn to work within the system by changing their goals, or they may become members of the deviant subculture by accepting and rationalizing social norms that are not what is widely accepted within the society. He then suggests when faced with this kind of strain over the long term, people respond to strain in one of the following five ways. Firstly, they may conform to these behaviors where they strive even harder to pursue the goals through socially approved paths. For example, if they are unable to afford university fees for financial reasons, they may strive to study even harder so that they can obtain a scholarship to go to university, or they may choose to work part time to support themselves through university. That would be the ideal situation. However, Merton in this case also emphasized four modes of adaptation in his theory. Firstly, people may innovate when they realize that they are unable to achieve these socially accepted goals. Um, they may turn to illegal means to find their path to legitimate success, in this case, financial security. If they find that they cannot achieve financial security through an acceptable job, they may find other ways to achieve this level of financial security, for example, by selling drugs. Next, there is a category of people that he refers to as ritualists, and these are the group of people who may try to change their goals, where they use socially approved means to achieve less elusive goals. For example, they may scale down their goals of what they consider to be financial stability or success. That is, they actually lower their expectations so it is more achievable. In the next category, it's what he calls the retreatist. And these are the group of people who may reject the socially approved goals and find alternate ways to escape from it. So they don't have to deal with the fact that they're unable to achieve these goals and may be seen as failure in the eyes of society. These are the people who, when faced with the strain of roadblocks to legitimate means, instead of choosing to actually pursue these goals or try and achieve less elusive goals, they instead choose to relinquish these goals altogether and retreat from society, for example, by escaping through the use or abuse of drugs and alcohol. Finally, he's got the group that he calls the rebels, and these people not only reject the socially approved goals, but they also find ways to replace them with goals that they may be more easily achievable to them. So therefore, these are the group of people who not only reject the way the current system is run, but they also attempt to change the system so that they no longer face these roadblocks. These are the group of people that often lead to change in society in a good way, but on the other hand, they could also lead to change in society by resorting to very illegal means to achieve these goals, such as terrorism, for an example. Merton goes on to say that the inability to achieve um, socially accepted goals could also result in what he calls frustration induced criminality. Again, here he emphasizes that crime is social in nature, it's not biological or individual in nature, and the reason that somebody actually turns to crime is because they face many blocked opportunities to achieve a specific goal. The constant blockage leads to strain and frustration that somebody cannot deal with in the long time, and therefore they may find that criminal or deviant behaviors actually offer them a better coping mechanism to help them deal with this frustration in the long run. However, more recent research suggests that someone is unlikely to turn or resort to criminal or deviant behaviors when faced with frustration, even in the long term, unless he or she is already part of a deviant subculture and has access to deviant norms or deviant peers who can teach him the so called deviant behaviors. Merton also goes on to propose that when faced with constant structural factors that lead to feelings of inequality and deprivation in the long run, this can also result in somebody resorting towards crime. In this case, he says that the structural factors that lead to feelings of inequality could be unfair treatment based on race, age, gender, but it could also be a result of, for example, poor family environment, not in the terms of not having enough money, but in terms of neglect or abuse as a child. When somebody compares themselves, especially to a reference group, and feels that they've been deprived of what they consider to be their right, either by their family or society, they may again feel that a good coping mechanism to deal with these feelings of deprivation is actually to resort to aggressive behaviors or criminal behaviors because then they feel that they're taking control of their lives and are taking back what they believe to be rightfully theirs. One example of frustration-induced criminality in the Singapore context was the Little India riots in 2013. Before I go on, I also want to make a caveat here that says that not all parties agree that it is a result of frustration, but there are some people who suggest that these riots were a result of long simmering frustrations of the migrant workers community in Singapore, particularly the South Asian community. If you remember, to give you some background to this, the Little India riots occurred in 2013, where a group of foreign workers from South Asia, particularly countries, for example, like India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, actually engaged in mob behavior, targeting firstly the bus driver and then also other vehicles that belong to authority in a specific area in Little India. What actually triggered the behavior is that a bus driver who was local actually accidentally ran over a foreign worker when he was crossing the street. The bus driver, I think, didn't realize that she had run over somebody, so she kept driving. When the emergency assistant vehicles came, in this case the ambulance, they didn't attend to the foreign worker straight away, but they attended to somebody else who was also injured, and this triggered a lot of anger and resentment, which led to the riots. There's some parties or some psychologists who believe that this actual mob behavior, although triggered by that incident, is a result of long pent up frustration caused by low wages, poor living conditions, and perhaps negative treatment by Singaporeans. Um, these long standing resentment actually was the catalyst for this behavior in that time. And the fact that there was a mob involved in this behavior actually encouraged others to get involved as well. The Singapore government took a very strong stance towards this, and they actually dealt with the people who were involved in this accident very hard, not accident, but this incident very harshly to make sure that such incidences don't occur again in the Singapore context or within Singapore. Another explanation for the involvement in very aggressive behaviors is what we know of as crimes of obedience. And these behaviors are actually something that happens or is more likely to happen in an environment where things are very hierarchical in nature. It usually occurs as an act in response to directions from an authority figure. One clear example that you probably remember is the Milgram experiment that you may have covered, where participants were actually asked to administer electric shocks to so called learners when they got an answer wrong. They were instructed to do this by somebody that they thought of as a person in authority or position of power, in this case, someone they thought to be a professor in a white lab coat, and they were told to increase the intensity of the electric shock the more answers the learner got wrong. What they didn't know is that the learner was actually a confederate or an actor who was actually reading out a script or acting out a script even when they were pretending to shout in pain. So when we look at crimes of obedience in real life, the idea behind it is that people are likely to behave illegally because someone in a position of power has told them to do so, even though these actions may not equate or may not be in line with their own principles. Um, it takes somebody who has a very strong personality or very strong convictions to actually resist authority. And this is even more true when we're looking at a very hierarchical environment like the uniformed services, for example, or even within the context of organized crime, where the hierarchy of a mafia group, for example, is very clear. And if you don't listen to somebody who is in a position of authority, you are likely to get severely punished for it. One sad example in our history is actually the story of the My Lai massacre. And this is a real incident that occurred in, I think, March 1968, where a group of American soldiers basically destroyed and annihilated a whole Vietnamese village because they were instructed to do so by their superiors. And in the process of destroying this village, in the so called name of actually fighting the enemy, they actually killed a lot of innocent villagers, which included women and children. This YouTube video here actually shows you some footage of the incident, but most of it actually focuses on an American soldier's recollection of what happened and why he did what he did, even though he knew or he felt it was wrong at that point in time. Now, I must warn you that there are some disturbing images or disturbing things that you will hear if you watch this video. So, if you feel like you don't want to do that, then that's fine. You can skip this video. Sometimes deviant behaviors could also be a result of the process of de-individuation. For example, what happened during the famous Stanford experiment, where a group of students were um, recruited to be participants in a study. This group was then divided into two subgroups, one which was supposed to be the prisoners within a prison, and another one to be the guards. The guards were given a lot of power over the prisoners, and over time, what they saw is that although these two groups were actually the same and there was not much difference between them, the guards started in acting in ways where they felt that it was their right to have a lot of power over the prisoners, and the prisoners had to do what they were told to do. De-individuation, in this sense, is a commonly used concept to explain expressions of collective behaviors in violent crowds, mindless hooliganism, for example. The explanation behind this is that when there is mob behavior, there is a loss of individuality and self imposed control in crowds. Individuals feel that they are not being observed and they're not going to be held accountable for their actions because they are acting in a group. As a result, their own levels of self censorship when it comes to their own behaviors is also reduced. This complex chain of events could also be explained by the fact that the high presence of others involved or engaging in the same behaviors gives them a sense of anonymity, and because they're part of this larger group, there may be a sense of loss of identity in the sense that their own convictions or moral values may not play such a strong role. As a result of this, they pay less attention to self regulative behaviors, and instead of following their own convictions or judgments, they obtain behavioral cues from the crowd around them. As a result, the individual restraints against criminal behaviors is reduced and they are more likely to be involved in these behaviors. This explanation, for example, could also be used to help explain the Little India riots that we talked about a little bit earlier. Another example of this is again from last year, where a group of SCDF NS men who were just about to pass out were actually caught on camera trashing and messing up their dorm. If you think about it, it was a really silly thing for them to do because they were just going to pass out and graduate from national service. But what they did, as you can see in these pictures, is they completely destroyed their dorms. They broke apart the bunk beds. They used the pieces of metal to break cupboards, to break the fans. They were also caught smoking in the dorms, which is not something that they were supposed to do. On a rational level, this may not make sense because obviously, when they were caught, they were punished, and instead of passing out and being free of their NS life, at least for a while, they had to extend their time in NS. Now, throughout history, scholars, writers, and criminologists have actually spent a lot of time and effort trying to discover the true nature of crime and criminals. As you've seen in the past few lectures, there are many, many theories that can explain why one person would commit violent crimes or less violent crimes, smaller crimes, bigger crimes, while others shy away from criminal and deviant behavior and may even be so disgusted by it altogether that they wouldn't even consider it. Now, at this point, we know that there is no one answer that actually explains everything because individuals do travel different pathways or they have different experiences that lead them to be involved in crime. And these experiences may also influence the types of criminal behaviors that they're actually involved in. So, as I said, there's no one answer, there is no one variable that causes all crime, but instead, it is likely to be a combination of beliefs, environmental factors, educational factors, parental or family factors, and peer associations that actually help determine whether one is to become a criminal or not. We also know that criminal behavior is a result of different factors at different stages of life. So, what may cause somebody to engage in deviant behavior when they're a teenager would be very different from what would cause somebody to engage in deviant behavior when they're much older. Now, when we look at all these theories, what's important to remember is that regardless of who or what the theory targets, each theory does hold some value in helping us understand criminal behaviors, and some theories hold great value in the explanation of crime and predisposition to becoming a criminal. What actually helps us understand this more holistically is a feasible integration of different theories. So, when you read anything on the psychology of criminal behavior, for example, when you're working on your assignment, you'll see that there are many, many theories that you can choose from. While one theory may focus on the criminal and why they commit crime, another may focus on the environmental factors, and yet another may focus on familial factors. And as I keep mentioning, there is no one theory, but actually an integration of theories that helps us understand the development of criminal behaviors. In this next slide, we're going to try and see how these different theories can be integrated to actually help us develop an overall understanding of criminal behaviors. What you will see on the slide is basically four different columns that explain different things. I'm going to explain each column in turn first. In the first column, we have antecedent conditions. That is the conditions that are already in place before even the earliest indicators of deviant behaviors appear. In the second place, we look at the earliest indicators or the earliest symptoms of whether somebody is likely to engage in deviant behaviors or not. In the next, we looked at the developmental processes that are involved in either the intensification of criminal behaviors or the intensifications of pro-social or non-violent behaviors. And finally, we look at some of the variables that would influence whether somebody chooses to continue offending or not, or whether somebody continues to engage in pro-social behaviors or not. Now, let's look at the antecedent conditions first. There are three different categories which we have looked at over the past few weeks. Firstly, they're the biological factors. Secondly, the psychological factors. And thirdly, the environmental factors. As we have covered, these biological factors could include the influence of genetics, how an imbalance of neurotransmitters may encourage aggressive behaviors, for example, brain injury and how injuries to certain parts of the brains could cause somebody not to think as rationally or may cause somebody to behave more impulsively, and also the roles of hormones such as testosterone, for example, in the occurrence of aggression. At a psychological level, we looked at how IQ levels may contribute towards the development of deviant behaviors. We touched on slightly, for example, on a psychopathic personality. This is something that we will look at in more detail in one of the lectures next term. And the role of temperament and attachment factors and other, I suppose, familial factors in the development of certain personality traits that may increase or decrease the likelihood of involvement in deviant behaviors. And finally, we've got things like socioeconomic status, for example, the role of poverty in education, role of family and family involvement in crime, for example, or family engagement in deviant behaviors, as well as the social environment. Environmental factors here would also include peer influences. Now, it's important to note that none of these three categories actually stand alone, but in fact, they interact with each other and influence each other in determining whether somebody is likely to show the childhood precursors to crime and violence. Some of the earliest indicators that somebody is likely to be involved in deviant behaviors later is or are listed here. Um, some of those factors include conduct disorder, where somebody is persistently defying authority, breaking rules, a child who is, for example, very aggressive or is likely to bully others or even engage in violent behaviors towards animals. A child who consistently breaks rules, who shows very early aggression, and this could be as young as 3 years old. Someone who's not able, or a child in this case, who's not able to regulate their emotions, especially the stronger negative emotions such as anger, distrust, resentment. And we also know that factors such as ineffective discipline by parents could contribute to crime and violence, especially if parents themselves engage in more harsh disciplinary practices. Now, these childhood precursors could result in the intensification of criminal behaviors. So that is, the more childhood precursors that are evident, the more like the likelihood of somebody intensifying their involvement in deviant behaviors. Now, some of these factors that could contribute towards the incentivification of criminal behaviors, which we have looked at earlier as well, is things like school failure. If you remember, academic performance and the ability to do well in school is negatively correlated with deviant behaviors. Hostile attribution, that is thinking that people in the world or around them are persecuting them or against them, are not treating them fairly. Association with delinquent peers who are likely to amplify delinquent traits that they may already have, substance abuse, and finally also the influence of media, especially through the process of modeling. On the other hand, children who achieve and do well in school, who have strong family bonds and associate with non-deviant peers are less likely to be involved in deviant or criminal behaviors and are more likely to exhibit pro-social or non-violent behaviors. We know that when criminal behavior is present, it is more likely to continue throughout the lifespan if these behaviors are consistently reinforced and there are many opportunities to offend. Thirdly, the continued presence of deviant peers in other stages of their lives are also likely to increase the likelihood of being involved in criminal behaviors. Now, this is a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation because if you're already involved in deviant behaviors, you're more likely to engage in deviant peers and you amplify and encourage each other in these activities. Feelings of socio-economic deprivation, which lead to frustration, can also result in continued offending, and social labeling, where people in society already expect you to behave in a certain way, may result in a somewhat self-fulfilling prophecy where people then continue to react in those ways. On the other hand, if these pro-social behaviors are reinforced, they're likely to continue. School achievement, which is related or which results in occupational achievement is less likely to result in deviant behaviors. Instead, it will reinforce the viability of pro-social behaviors. And someone who's committed to a meaningful relationship, either with an individual romantically or friendship or friends, or even through involvement in pro-social activities like church or mosque or temple or a volunteer group, is more likely to continue pro-social behaviors.